The Torah tells us that Eisav saw how Yitzchak guided Yaakov to marry, and that influenced his own choices for marriage. What exactly did he see, and how exactly did it influence him? The specifics of how Rashi explains this particular section will give us a tremendous amount of insight. So in Pasuk Vayishma Yaakov Gomer Vayelech B'den Aram, at the end of the parasha, when the Pasuk tells us that Yaakov listened to his father and he went to Padan Aram, is Rashi Mefarish. Rashi says a very interesting thing. If Diveret Vayishma Yaakov, he quotes those two words that Yaakov listened, and then he says it's actually not about Yaakov. This is linked to what was written just before, which is Vayar Eisav Kiverach Yitzchak B'Gomer, that Eisav saw that Yitzchak had blessed Yaakov, and he sent him to Padan Aram, and the fact that Yitzchak disapproved of the daughters of Canaan, and therefore he went to Yishmael to find a wife. So learning in Pashas, what's the simple meaning of Rashi over here? Rashi wants to clarify for us that this pasuk can't be talking about Yaakov. By telling us that Yaakov listened to Yitzchak, the Torah is not telling us that Yaakov listened to Yitzchak. As Yaakov Avinu had gefolgt seinem Vater gegangen in Padan Aram, that Yaakov followed his father's instructions and went to Padan Aram, because that Torah already told us before. Das ist schön, erzählt geworden früher in der Parasha, Yitzchak is Yaakov Vayelech Gomer. Torah already told us that Yitzchak sent Yaakov and he went. So we already know that Yaakov listened to Yitzchak. Why then is it saying Vayishma again? On deep psukim, v'shtein far noch vayishma Yaakov reden gor wegen Eisav. So look at the context. The psukim immediately before and after this statement vayishma Yaakov are all in the context of Eisav's perception and behavior. Deriba is Rashi masber. Therefore, Rashi explains as vayishma Yaakov kum behemshach vayar Eisav v'shtein in friedigen pasuk, that this vayishma Yaakov is part of what Eisav saw, which is already described from the previous pasuk. The pasuk rechnet is noch aprat was Eisav hat gesehen. Vayishma Yaakov is another detail of what Eisav saw and what influenced his behavior. That's what Rashi is telling us, and that's going to raise 4 questions about this. First of all, Rashi surely could have done this much simpler. He could have spoken much more briefly. This point that Rashi makes, that Vayishma Yaakov is part of the bigger picture that Eisav saw, which influenced his decision. Rashi could have said it briefly. Vayishma Yaakov is linked to the earlier part of Vayar Eisav, and that's it. Why does Rashi repeat all the details of what Eisav saw? He saw that Yaakov listened. He saw that Yaakov went to Padan Aram. He saw that the daughters of Canaan are no good. Why do we need all that information? And that information is already in the Torah itself. Question number 2. Rashi seems to miss a very important point. The pasuk tells us that there was another detail Eisav saw, which was that Yitzchak instructed Yaakov, don't marry a girl from Canaan. Why doesn't Rashi include that in his commentary? Completely ignores what seems to be a really important piece of information, which is dafka, don't marry a girl from Canaan. Also, Gimel. One of the details that this Vayishma Yaakov is linked to, surely the logic is, okay, so Vayishma Yaakov, as Rashi says, is linked to information about what Eisav noticed earlier. Right? It's attached to what was written earlier in the Torah. So you'd expect that whatever Rashi is going to discuss must be things that happened before Vayishma Yaakov. That's what you'd expect, right? But the actual part where Yaakov listens to his father, that's not Inyan Shel Maila. Shouldn't be discussed over here. And especially the part that Eisav notices that the daughters of Canaan are objectionable to Yitzchak. That's something which only comes later. Rashi is telling us Vayishma Yaakov is attached to information that comes earlier. Why mention a later piece of information? And lastly, Dalet, Nachme Pele is what's even more surprising is that Rashi includes what Rashi is Messiah that Eisav went to Yishmael to find a wife. That's not one of the details of what Eisav saw, because Rashi is saying we're going to talk over here about things that Eisav noticed. Well, going to Yishmael is not something he noticed, it's something he did because of what he noticed. Now, when he realized that Yitzchak does not approve of the Canaanite girls, then he went to Yishmael. So you can't tell us that, well, Rashi wants to explain, by telling us that Eisav went to marry somebody from Yishmael, he wants to explain to us that the Vayar Eisav, what Eisav noticed, haben der Firze Vayarech Eisav Yishmael, caused him, right? He noticed all these things, that how Yitzchak guided Yaakov and what Yitzchak's attitude was towards the Bnei Canaan, and that caused Eisav to go to Yishmael. And that's why Rashi gives us all these details. Well, you can't tell me that Rashi's quoting all these details so we'll realize why Eisav decides to marry a daughter of Yishmael. But der Inyan, as Vayerisav is Akdama und die Sibur von Vayerisav Gomer, is verstandig von sich allein. We don't need Rashi for this. We could work it out on our own. We read the story, we see that Eisav notices Yitzchak's attitude towards the daughters of Canaan, and then he goes to Yishmael. We could put the pieces of the puzzle together. We don't need Rashi to connect the dots for us. Even without Rashi telling us that the Vayishma Yaakov links back to things that Eisav had noticed, as mentioned earlier in the Torah, we'll understand that all of the details related in the pasuk, except possibly for the detail that Yaakov himself listened, are all building to what happened next, which is that Eisav goes to Yishmael. Why does Rashi have to tell it to us? It's seemingly self-understood. Von dem, was Rashi stellt das herein in sein Pirush, the fact that Rashi does tell us this information, and he includes it as part of his explanation of the whole story that's linked back to what Eisav noticed, is verstandig, as das kommt in Verbindung mit dem Pirush, means that the fact that Eisav went to marry a daughter of Yishmael is relevant to and attached to and connected with the interpretation that Rashi is giving us. In other words, once Rashi has told us what we didn't automatically know, that Vayishma Yaakov is part of what Eisav had seen, including all the details Rashi gives us, then only then can we truly understand why Eisav goes to Yishmael, which is why Rashi includes it in his interpretation. Now, what we've got to work out is, what has Rashi told us? By saying Vayishma Yaakov is attached to what Eisav had perceived, what is Rashi telling us about that helps us understand why he goes to marry Yishmael? So in order to understand this, we're going to note that the Torah tells us twice that Eisav saw what was going on. The question is, why twice? The Torah tells us once that Eisav saw. What did he see the first time? That Yitzchak had blessed Yaakov. He sent him to Padan Aram. And instructed him who to marry. Then the Torah says again, and Eisav saw he saw that Canaanite girls are not approved by his father, and therefore he went to Yishmael. The Torah is obviously telling us that there are two different perspectives or insights that Eisav had. Each one is a different kind of perception, which is why the Torah would repeat it twice. Und der Chelek zwischen die zwei Vayar is, so what's the difference between the first time where he sees all the things that happen with Yaakov and the second time that he sees that the daughters of Canaan are no good? So to understand that, let's go back to what Rashi said in Parshas Vayera, where also it says Avram saw the angels and then he saw the angels. Why does it say it twice? So what Rashi told us then will help us understand here as well. The first is literal. He actually saw. Avram Avinu saw the Malachim. Eisav saw the instructions that Yitzchak gave to Yaakov. The second is awareness and perception. Avraham Avinu noticed that the angels weren't moving, weren't approaching him. Eisav worked out, he understood something from the fact that the instructions from Yitzchak to Yaakov were to go to Padan Aram and marry somebody there. In other words, the first Vayar is that Eisav saw things that happened to other people. Zwischen Yitzchak and Yaakov, and the interaction between Yitzchak and his son Yaakov. It's all third person, things that happened to other people. Der zweite Vayar is l'shein Havana, whereas the second Vayar is his own realization. He suddenly clicked that Yitzchak does not approve of girls from Canaan. This is no longer seeing things happen to other people. This is realizing something about himself, which is relevant in his life. And this realization prompts him, as the pasuk continues to tell us, to have to take a decision, which is to go to Yishmael to find a wife. So now we've got this great insight that there's these two Vayaras happening, so we still have to understand. The Tachas from ganzen Sipur, from Vayar Eisav ist doch zu der erklären die Sibbe, was hat Fried, als Vayelach Eisav lishma vayikach gomer. The whole purpose of this entire section of Torah is to tell us why Eisav went to Yishmael. That's what we're trying to solve. Why did Eisav go to Yishmael? If that's the case, on Eivdem, so then we just need the second realization that Eisav has. He realizes that Yitzchak does not approve of daughters of Canaan. And therefore he acts in a particular way and he goes to Yishmael. Why does the Torah need us to know that Eisav saw all these details about Yaakov? That Yitzchak told Yaakov that he should go to Padan Aram, and he blessed him, and he instructed him. Why is that relevant? All we need to know is Eisav realized, I shouldn't marry somebody from Canaan, therefore he goes to Yishmael. At the very most, the Torah should just told us that Eisav saw that Yitzchak told Yaakov not to marry a daughter of Canaan. That would have helped for us to know, what clarified for him to realize that the daughters of Canaan are no good, and therefore he goes to Yishmael. And as we've already pointed out, that's the one thing Rashi does not include in his explanation. So why do we need all of this information? And the answer is because the Torah is telling us over here that Eisav has a perception of what is going on, which is different to what we would have expected. The Birindem, das was die Torah erzählt, die ganze Arichos ist fein von Atmir in dem Minim von Vayelech Eisav el Yishmael. The reason the Torah goes through all of these details is because the fact that Eisav decided to marry a daughter of Yishmael, although it shows us that he was conscious of the fact his father did not approve of Bnei Canaan, actually leaves us with a gaping question. Das was Eisav gegeben nehmen Yishmaels Tochter, the fact that he wants to marry Yishmael's daughter, und hat nicht genommen von Bnei Canaan, was hat sich gefunden beschreinos, and he didn't go to the closer families of Canaan in order to find a shidduch. Is gewinn bechtei zu weisen, als steht nicht ab von Yaakov, und neucher ist mit keinem den Ratzuk von Yitzchak an. It's because Eisav wants to show, I'm no less than Yaakov, I also want to fulfill what Yitzchak said. So if Yitzchak disapproves of Bnei Canaan, I'm not going there. That's Eisav's nature, to show how righteous he is. Look at me, I'm listening to my father Yitzchak. If that's the case, if he's listening to Yitzchak, why is he only listening to half of what Yitzchak said? There's no moving. Yitzchak hat doch gesagt, Yaakov nicht nur when Yitzchak told Yaakov who to marry, he didn't only give him a restriction, don't marry a girl of Canaan, but he told him where to go, to Padan Aram, to the extended family, to find a wife over there. Und Yaakov hat Mekayim given seidem tzad shlilu and seidem tzad chiyuvi. And Yaakov respected his father's restriction and did not go to the Bnei Canaan, and he respected his father's expectation and he went to Padan Aram. Hat nicht genommen von den Bnei Canaan und ist gegangen in Padan Aram. So now what about Eisav? Was hat Eisav nur nicht genommen Isha Bnei Canaan? If Eisav is so insistent that he wants to show that he's listening to his father's instructions, why does he only keep the one half, avoiding the daughters of Canaan? So when he came Padan Aram, we don't find him going to Padan Aram. So if he's watched what Yitzchak told Yaakov, and the Torah feels that that's important information for us, and based on that he makes his decision, why is his decision not to go to Padan Aram and find a wife there? That's what Rashi wants to explain. So to explain this, that's why the Torah told us Vayar twice, because there are two different processes going on in Eisav's brain. As in die Sachen, welche Eisav hat gesehen, seine gewinnen Kanal zwei Sugim, there are two stages and two types of perception that Eisav has in the story. Was jeder kommt meist bei seiner anderen Prat in Vayelech Eisav el Yishmael. And each stage or perception helps us appreciate one angle of why Eisav goes to Yishmael. Der Shavayar is Mazber for was Eisav had angenommen as darf nicht gehen Padan Aram. The first thing that Eisav observed about what Yitzchak had told Yaakov reassured him that he did not have to go to Padan Aram, even though Yaakov did. And then zweite Vayar for was Eisav is gegangen nehmen an Isha von Yishmael. And the second realization he had, which is about the problem with Bnei Canaan, that's what convinced him to marry a daughter of Yishmael. Let's understand this. V'habir. The Shlichus was Yitzchak had geschickt Yaakov in Padan Aram lekachle misham Isha. The fact that Yitzchak instructed Yaakov that he has to go to Padan Aram and that's where he's going to find a wife, Eisav sees that as a specific instruction which is only relevant to Yaakov. It's that Eisav's Meinung gewen nicht der Fall, weil Yitzchak gehalten as no dort is a shidduch hara'oi. As far as Eisav understands it, it's not that Yitzchak's telling Yaakov that's the only place you could find an appropriate shidduch, nor a mittel Keli zu bekommen die Brachos mit welcher Yitzchak ihm gebencht. Eisav says, Vayar ki beirach Yitzchak. He has seen that Yitzchak gave Yaakov a bracha and then told him to go to Padan Aram. In Esav's logic, what Yitzchak is telling Yaakov is, if you want my brachas to manifest, you have to go to Padan Aram to find a wife. The pasuk is Donacham Umadgesh Vayar Eisav ki beirach gomer v'shilach Eisav Padan Aram gomer bevorchoi Eisav gomer. The pasuk emphasizes this, that he goes to Padan Aram in the context of being blessed by his father. So Eisav says, that's got nothing to do with me. Und der Rebbe hat gehalten, als der Ihnen von Vayishma Yaakov gomer vayelech Padan Aram is an agab lois Yaakov. And so therefore, in Esav's interpretation, Yaakov going to Padan Aram, following his father's instructions, is something that is specific to his story. Und Sam Eisav and Hottes Nikin Sheiches. It's got nothing to do with how Eisav has to behave, because Eisav doesn't get those brachas. Und therefore is a Nikigang in Padan Aram. So therefore he has no motivation to look for a shidduch in Padan Aram, because in his mind, Padan Aram is not a shidduch destination, it's a facilitation for a bracha that Yitzchak wants to give to Yaakov. It's not a bracha available to Eisav, so he doesn't have to go to Padan Aram at all. So that original Vayar, and that's why the Torah gives us all of that information, contextualizes for us why that Vayar does not influence Esav's decision of where and who to marry. Whereas when Yitzchak says clearly, don't take a wife from Canaan, is in Den Vayar Haben Eisav, that helped Eisav to realize, he then understood that Yitzchak completely disapproves of daughters of Canaan, and therefore that is something which does affect him, because he doesn't want to obviously marry somebody that his father finds objectionable. That's why he goes to Yishmael. Now that we know that Esav's thought process is in two different stages, the one which excuses him from going to Padan Aram in his mind, and the other which requires him to marry somebody who is not from Canaan, now we can understand why Rashi gave us so much detail in his interpretation. Like der Malam is moving the Arichas in Pirish Rashi. Nachdem Rashi sagt, dass Yishma Yaakov goyim is nit ha-maimar muzgar, no mechuber un ha-prat in Vayar Eisav. The first thing Rashi clarifies for us is that when the Torah tells us Vayishma Yaakov, it's not like it's pausing in the middle of the story of Eisav to just remind us what happened with Yaakov, but rather it's describing part of what Eisav saw and noticed and realized. Once Rashi's told us that, then kommt Rashi b'avorin was beim Elshon Vayar Eisav far die Werte Vayishma Yaakov goyim steht Vayitzava olav leim lo yisikachi shomi b'nei Canaan. So then Rashi says, before these words Vayishma Yaakov, because remember Vayishma Yaakov is linked to what came before. What came before? An instruction that Yitzchak gave Yaakov, don't marry a daughter of Canaan. Let's explain that. The way we've explained it as the Eisav Esav's need to gain kein Padan Aram, that the first series of events that Eisav noticed were enough to convince him he did not have to go to Padan Aram to find a shidduch. Because all of those details of the story Eisav was clear, did not apply in his life. Kommt doch aus, als Vayitzava olav leim lo yisikachi shomi b'nei Canaan hat shaychus zum zweiten Vayar Eisav, was kommt mas b'sein Eisav's nit nemen ha'isha mibnei Canaan. So now that we know that all the other detail of Yitzchak telling Yaakov, I'm blessing you and you have to go to Padan Aram, is not relevant to Eisav, now we realize that the part where he says don't marry a daughter of Canaan must be relevant to Eisav. The Rebbe is Rashi Meforish as Vayishma Yaakov is a mechuber inyan shamayla. That's why Rashi has to tell us. The Vayishma Yaakov links us to the information that the Torah provided just before this. On Taisha the Protim Tzevel Chesem mechuber kiberach Yitzchak v'gam v'chishilach Eisav paden Aram. And what is Vayishma Yaakov linked to? All those issues that Eisav observed that were, in his interpretation, specific to Yaakov and not relevant in his life. On springt da Ribbon is mash mit dem Prat fun Eisav gomer sikach gomer. Rashi doesn't mention anything about the direct instruction, don't marry a daughter of Canaan, because the don't marry a daughter of Canaan is not linked to the first Vayar, the first perception that Eisav had of what Yitzchak was telling only Yaakov. Actually, lo sikach isha libni, lo sikach isha b'bnei Canaan, that Eisav sees as relevant to him, in other words, linked to the second Vayar. That's why Rashi doesn't mention it here when he's interpreting the first Vayar. Der mit is a madish as der Vayitzav gomer is in Eisav's re'iyah nit negets vayishma Yaakov gomer vayelech baden Aram. We have to know that from Eisav's perspective, that instruction, don't marry a daughter of Canaan, is not part of the instructions that are unique to Yaakov. Dem oisver von ersten Vayar. Now, shaykh zum zweiten Vayar Eisav, rather, that is something which helps Eisav come to the realization of which kind of woman is off the cards and cannot be a shidduch. And that, Kirois B'nois Canaan, helps him to realize that daughters of Canaan are no good. And Rashi then fills in what happens next. He goes to Yishmael, realizing that Yitzchak does not want any of his sons marrying a daughter of Canaan. And there in this movement that Shein Rashi, we can also now focus on the specific language that Rashi used. Why Rashi brings up this point that daughters of Canaan are no good. Rashi says that after he's already told us that Eisav saw that Yaakov went to Padan Aram. Das was Vayitzav gomer steht bekostet beim ersten Vayar Eisav. If you look in the pasuk, the part that says that Yitzchak instructed Yaakov, don't marry a daughter of Canaan, is actually part of the conversation under the first Vayar, which is supposedly how Eisav is seeing the story unfold. Is the farval befoil is vorgekommen far vayelech padena Aram. And the reason the Torah puts it at that point is because chronologically that's actually when it happened. Obviously, Yitzchak told Yaakov not to marry a daughter of Canaan before Yaakov left. Because obviously after Yaakov had left, Yitzchak could not have instructed him. So chronologically, don't marry a daughter of Canaan belongs before Yaakov going to Padan Aram. But that's from a chronological point of view. And of course, then the Torah has to tell us Yaakov followed through. But when we're explaining the thought process of Eisav, which is not locked into the chronology of events, it's his thought process, then das was der Pasuk lefi Perishashe will mazbe sein die zwei Protim in Anhogas Eisav kenal Sifim Gimel Dalet gehört es zum zweiten Vayar Eisav. When the Torah is explaining the two stages of the thought process of Eisav, then in Eisav's mind the Vayetzav Yitzchak, that Yitzchak instructed Yaakov not to marry a daughter of Canaan, belongs to the second phase of Eisav's logical processing. And that explains why Rashi, even though he's telling us Vayishma Yaakov is linked to certain details of what Eisav had perceived earlier, but he doesn't only bring that, Rashi adds detail, because remember, we asked the question originally, why doesn't Rashi just keep it really smooth, quick, efficient? Why does he add all the details? Why does he add the details? That Yaakov listened, and he went to Padan Aram, and the fact that the daughters of Canaan were bad in the eyes of Yitzchak. All of that information is relevant because der mit is Rashi oisen zum Masber sein. Rashi wants to explain because what Rashi needs us to know is why the words Vayishma Yaakov and the Pasuk are specifically linked to where Yitzchak blesses and Yaakov goes, or Yitzchak sends Yaakov to Padan Aram. But Rashi wants us to know that it's not linked. Vayishma Yaakov is not linked to the part where Yitzchak instructs Yaakov not to marry a daughter of Canaan. Why? Weil der Ort von dem Prat Vayitzav Gomer, welcher drückt aus durch sein Tam in die Werte von Chirois von Canaan, because that detail of telling Yaakov not to marry a daughter of Canaan is like an Eisav noch dem ganzen Seder von Vayishma Yaakov gem vayelech padan aram. In the thought process inside Esav's brain is only the second phase of his thought process, and therefore only actually occurs after he has reflected on all the details mentioned earlier in the Torah, that Yaakov listened and that he was blessed and that he went to Padan Aram. As we have explained, the instruction not to marry a daughter of Canaan in Esav's mind belongs in the second Vayar, the realization that Eisav has that I need to avoid a daughter of Canaan. Und der Rebbe bringt Rashi euch dem Eisav v'holacham hu al Yishmael. Therefore, Rashi has to add, even though it's not something that is stated directly in the pasuk, but Rashi has to inform us. Therefore, Eisav went to Yishmael. Bechdei zu klar machen, as vayitzav gomer is leiten inal drois b'nois Knan, nita inin was is mechuber zu vayishma Yaakov gomer vayelech padan aram. So Rashi will have it clear for us that the part where Yaakov is instructed not to marry a daughter of Canaan is not included and attached to his response, but rather norachelik von zweiten Vayar was hat gebavrit Eisav halicha zu Yishmael kanal, but is actually attached to Esav's response and the fact that Eisav then perceives that he should not marry a daughter of Canaan and he should marry a daughter of Yishmael. And lastly, the fact that Rashi in his Pirush does not include those words Vayitzav, even though the Torah does. So we've now explained when the Torah says Vayitzav, that Yitzchak instructed Yaakov not to marry a daughter of Canaan, that's actually the Torah telling us about Esav's thought process. The fact that Rashi doesn't include those words that Yitzchak had instructed Eisav to marry, not to marry a daughter of Canaan, the reason Rashi doesn't say that, right, is as nit bloß mit Tzadem, was in dem Eisav gemacht Eisav gesehen in welcher hat nicht Chibur zu die andere Protem. It's not only because Rashi wants us to know that in Esav's perception, that instruction not to marry a daughter of Canaan is different to the other instructions. The other instructions were only for Yaakov, and this instruction Eisav sees as being relevant to him as well, because as we've mentioned, that Eisav interprets this as something which is relevant to him. The truth is that as far as Eisav is concerned, when Yaakov listens to Yitzchak and goes to Padan Aram, that's actually not even a direct result of the instruction from Yitzchak not to marry a daughter of Canaan. Because Eisav's meaning is Yaakov mit sein Genken Padan Aram darf gewinnen eusen Ausfolgen Yitzchak Schliches, bechdei zu bekommen die Broches. The way Eisav interprets Yaakov's behavior, Yaakov is not going to Padan Aram to respect his father's wishes not to marry a daughter of Canaan. He's going to Padan Aram to get the brochas, which are contingent on marrying the right person. He's not doing it because his father instructed him not to marry. And actually, based on that, Eisav thinks of himself as greater than Yaakov. Yaakov is self-interested in Esav's view. He's going to marry a girl so that he'll get the brochas. And Eisav is saying, and I am sensitive to what my father really cares about, and therefore I'm making my marriage decision based on what my father wants. That is what leads us to the part that Rashi does include about Eisav choosing to marry a daughter of Yishmael. Eisav mit sein Gehen zu Yishmael. The fact that Eisav went to Yishmael is given Oisen zu weisen, he wanted to illustrate nicht nur mekayim Yitzchak's rotzen. He didn't only want to say, look, I'm a good son because my father said don't marry these girls, so I'm not going to marry one of those girls and therefore I'm going to Yishmael. But more than that, nor euch as by felt nicht legabe Yaakov. He wanted to illustrate that actually I am no less than Yaakov in terms of dedication to Hashem. In fact, Eisav believes that he's better than Yaakov. How so? Is noch feiner von ihm. Weil Eisav versucht zu mekayim sein Yitzchak zu rotzen, Chotches auf dem nicht stave geworden. Eisav wants the world to believe that he was alive and awake to what Yitzchak wanted and was willing to do it without being told. And therefore, in his estimation, he's better even than Yaakov, who had to be told who not to marry, and even then was kind of interested in getting the brochas. Eisav says, wow, look at me. I'm willing to do what my father wants, even without having to be told to do so.